Welcome to the deep dive. In our interconnected world today, everything feels linked. Technology, business, finance, even, geopolitics sometimes.
Absolutely. And that connection is super critical, maybe nowhere more so than in the financial sector.
Right. Cybersecurity there, it's not just like an IT thing tucked away in a back room anymore.
No way. It's fundamental. It's this constant evolving challenge. You've got new threats popping up all the time, plus this incredibly dense web of rules and regulations to navigate.
Exactly. So to help you make sense of it, we've really dug into the source material. We're talking regulatory digest, reports from big players like the World Bank, central banks, the usual suspects.
And we also looked specifically at research on something that causes a lot of headaches, moving financial data across borders.
Yeah, that adds a whole other layer.
Yeah.
So our goal here is really to cut through the noise, pull out the most critical stuff from these sources for you.
We want to give you a clearer picture of what's happening in financial cybersecurity regulation and, importantly, those friction points when data has to travel internationally.
Think of it as your guide to what's really driving security and compliance in finance right now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's unpack it. And, as we start digging into this complexity, all these rules, these policy responses, it feels like a good moment to thank our episode sponsors.
Oh, definitely.
That's www.globalcompliancemap.com and www.generatepolicy.com. They're fantastic resources if you're trying to, make sense of global rules and actually turn them into policies that work. We'll touch on that connection again later.
Good point. Okay, so first things first. Why all the fuss? Why is cybersecurity seen as such a massive deal for finance?
Yeah, what do the sources say is driving this intense focus?
Well, it's stark, actually. We found this U.S. congressional hearing transcript from 2021. The CEOs of the 6 biggest Wall Street banks were there.
Okay.
And they were asked about the biggest threats. They named cybersecurity. Not just a threat, but the greatest threat to their own firms and, crucially, to the whole financial system.
Wow. The greatest threat. Putting it above, market volatility or even things like pandemics or climate change, at least in that specific context.
In that context, yes, it's a powerful statement. And it's not just them. Broader reports like the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report, they consistently rank cyber threats right up there near the top.
So it's a widespread concern at the highest levels.
It really underscores the potential for, massive disruption.
Yeah.
Think about how interconnected global finance is. An attack could ripple through the system incredibly fast.
And these aren't just theoretical worries, are they? The sources mention specific kinds of attacks.
Oh, yeah. Very specific. Ransomware gets called out a lot, where attackers lock up systems and demand payment.
Nasty stuff.
Definitely. And there's a huge emphasis on breaches impacting third-party service providers.
So not hitting the bank directly, but someone they rely on.
Exactly. Think cloud providers, software vendors, payment processors. The list goes on. If they get compromised, the bank is exposed.
Yeah.
That supply chain vulnerability. It's a theme that just keeps coming up in the source materials.
That makes total sense. Your security is only as strong as your weakest link, and increasingly, that link might be external.
Precisely. And the data paints an interesting picture, too. There's a report from the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements.
Central Banks Bank.
Right. They noted that back in 2020, during all the COVID disruption, the financial sector actually got targeted more often by hackers compared to other sectors.
So a prime target, then.
Yes. But, and this is kind of surprising, maybe another BIS paper suggested that even though they face more attacks, the average cost per successful attack might actually be lower for finance firms.
Lower. How does that work? More attacks, less cost per attack.
Well, the thinking in the sources is that it's partly down to the sheer amount the financial sector has invested in security over the years, much more than many other sectors.
So they're attacked more, but maybe better prepared to handle it, limit the damage.
That seems to be the idea. They've built up defenses, response capabilities. They spend a lot to mitigate the impact when something does get through.
Shows real commitment, I guess.
Yeah.
The sources also talk about cyber losses in terms of operational risk.
Right. Operational risk is the broader category, things like internal fraud, employee mistakes, system failures, that kind of thing.
Cool.
Now, historically, if you just count the number of incidents, cyber losses have been a relatively small fraction of total operational risk losses.
Interesting.
But, and this is a crucial point highlighted in a Brookings paper, cyber adversaries are sentient. They think, they adapt, they actively look for weaknesses.
Unlike a power outage or a rogue trader, maybe.
Exactly. A natural disaster doesn't change its tactics. A hacker does. This makes the threat fundamentally different, and it's why cyber attacks have that potential for truly systemic, widespread damage if, say, a critical payment system gets taken down.
Ah, okay. So it's the potential scale and the intelligent adversary that drives the fear, even if the average reported loss might be managed.
That's it. That's what keeps regulators awake at night. And naturally, the response from those regulators has been, well, pretty massive.
Yeah, massive feels like the right word. Our sources show just this explosion of regulations, guidance, frameworks all over the globe.
It's definitely a crowded space. And it's not new either. The sources show this has been building for a while. South Korea, Russia had stuff back in 2007. U.S. regulators issued key guidance in 2011. Singapore in 2013.
And then bigger things like the EU's NIS directive, GDPR in 2016, plus the NIST frameworks in the U.S. that lots of people use, has been a steady ramp up.
A clear trend, yeah. More focus, more rules over time.
So even though these rules come from different countries, different bodies, are there common threads, like core ideas that keep showing up?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of convergence on the essentials. First and foremost, governance. Huge emphasis on this. Meaning, cyber risk isn't just for the IT department. The sources stress it's a strategic enterprise-level risk. The board, senior management, they have to own it, understand it, allocate proper resources.
So it has to come from the top down, like the NDCD handbook principles or guidelines from Malaysia or India's RBI you mentioned.
Exactly those examples. Boards need the right expertise available to them, and they need to make sure the money and people are there. Cyber needs to be in the boardroom, not just the server room.
Okay, boardroom buy-in. What's next?
Well, flowing from that, you see mandates for comprehensive risk management frameworks.
Not just a checklist, then?
No, definitely not. These need to be dynamic, cover the whole organization, identify risks, assess them, figure out how to mitigate them, and they have to adapt because the threats are always changing. Think frameworks from Nigeria's CBN or Saudi Arabia's SAMA or the US FSSEC profile. They all push for embedding cyber risk management everywhere.
Got it. So you have the framework, you're managing risk. But inevitably, sometimes things will still go wrong.
Right. Which leads directly to incident response and recovery. This is critical.
How quickly you react?
And how effectively. Regulations demand clear plans for what to do when an incident hits. And, importantly, timely reporting.
How timely?
It varies quite a bit, actually. We saw examples like 24 hours in Kenya, just 1 hour for U.S. federal systems reporting to U.S. CERT, 72 hours under GDPR for data breaches.
Wow, 1 hour is tight.
It is. And resources like the Financial Stability Board's toolkit offer guidance on best practices here. The goal is containment, yes, but also getting critical functions back online. Business continuity is key.
And you can't just assume your plans and defenses work. You have to test them, right?
Exactly. Testing and assurance. This is increasingly mandated. Basic penetration testing. Pen testing is pretty common, like an annual requirement in Georgia.
But it goes beyond that.
Oh, yes. The big trend is towards more sophisticated intelligence-led testing. You hear terms like red teaming.
Where you simulate a real attacker.
Precisely. Using the tactics and techniques real adversaries use. Frameworks like Saudi Arabia's SAMA or the EU's Tiber EU framework require this kind of realistic testing. The UK's CBS program was an early voluntary example. It's about seeing how your whole defense system holds up people, processes, tech against a determined attacker.
Makes sense against those sentient adversaries. And independent audits are part of this assurance piece, too.
Yep. Annual independent audits are often required as well, like in the Georgian example.
Okay, so testing. Now, you mentioned earlier the huge risk from the supply chain. Third-party risk management must be a big focus, too.
Huge. Especially now with so much reliance on outsourcing and the cloud.
Right. Everyone's using cloud services.
And regulators know it, so the rules require serious due diligence before you sign up a vendor. Strong contracts with clear security requirements. Ongoing monitoring of their security. And importantly, the right to audit them.
You need to be able to check up on them.
Absolutely. Guidelines from Singapore's MAS, EBA recommendations on cloud in Europe, they all drive this point home. An IF paper we saw also highlights that while cloud is great, it brings its own risks, like concentration risk.
What's that? Too many eggs in one basket.
Essentially, yeah. If too many major financial firms rely on the same one or two big cloud providers, what happens if that provider has a major outage or breach? Systemic risk again.
Good point. And all these elements, governance, risk management, response, testing, third party, they all seem to feed into this broader idea of operational resilience.
That's exactly right. It's become a major buzzword, but it's the ultimate goal. Can your critical operations keep running or be restored quickly despite a disruption, including a major cyber attack?
Keeping the lights on, basically.
Pretty much. Principles from the Basel Committee touch on this, and the EU's new DORA Regulation Digital Operational Resilience Act is entirely focused on boosting this capability across the financial sector.
Wow. Okay, so it's definitely not just random rules. It's a really comprehensive, multi-layered approach regulators are taking globally.
It is, and interestingly, many of these national rules actually point back to common international standards or frameworks.
Like NIST or ISO.
Exactly. You see NIST cybersecurity framework, the ISO 27000 series, COBIT, CybOC referenced quite a bit. So while each country sets its own specific rules, there's a degree of global agreement on what good looks like.
Which is helpful, I suppose, but it still sounds incredibly complex to track all these regulations across different countries if you operate internationally.
Oh, it is, absolutely. Knowing which rules apply where and how to translate them into actual workable internal policies and controls, that's a massive task.
And this really highlights the value of tools that can help manage that complexity. Making sense of that global map of requirements.
For sure. It's fundamental. You can't build effective security if you don't understand the regulatory baseline you need to meet. That clarity is essential.
Which, again, brings us back to why resources like www.globalcompliancemap.com for tracking those rules and www.generatepolicy.com for turning them into action can be so valuable in this space.
Couldn't agree more. Navigating that regulatory maze is step one.
Okay, so we've got the threats, the regulations within countries. But finance is global. Data flies everywhere instantly. And this is where you said things get really complicated. Cross-border data transfers.
Yeah, this is a major friction point. The whole digital economy, especially finance, relies on data moving smoothly across borders.
But data protection laws are usually national, tied to physical territory.
Exactly. So what happens when you need to transfer personal data, customer information, employee data from somewhere with strong protection, like the EU under GDPR?
Which has famously strict rules.
To a country maybe with weaker standards or different government surveillance laws. There's a real risk that the data loses the protection it had.
And this isn't just a theoretical risk.
Not at all. This clash between global data flows and national privacy laws, plus some countries pushing for localization, demanding data stays physically inside their borders, creates huge operational challenges for banks and financial firms operating internationally.
The sources mentioned the Schrems court cases in the EU being really significant here. What was that about?
Those were landmark cases. Basically, an Austrian privacy advocate challenged data transfers, particularly to the U.S. The European Court agreed there were concerns about whether U.S. surveillance laws provided an equivalent level of protection to EU law.
Equivalent protection. That's the key phrase.
That's the core principle. It established that you can't just rely on a contract to protect data if the legal system in the destination country doesn't offer adequate safeguards, especially against government snooping.
So the destination country's laws matter just as much as the contract you sign. Companies try to use things like standard contractual clauses, SCCs, or binding corporate rules, BCRs though, right?
They do. SCCs are template contracts approved by regulators. BCRs are for internal company group transfers. They're designed to build in safeguards contractually. But the sources note they've been criticized. How effective are they really if the local law overrides them? And how easy is it for an individual whose data might be misused abroad to actually enforce those contractual rights or get compensation? It puts a heavy burden on the company sending the data to assess the destination country's laws and risks, which is, frankly, really hard.
A legal minefield. And courts themselves seem wary about ordering data transfers across borders sometimes.
Yeah, there's a judicial angle, too. We saw an example from a Singapore court being cautious about ordering a company to produce data stored in another country.
Yeah.
They have to balance the need for evidence in their case against potentially violating another country's laws or data sovereignty. It just shows the inherent tension.
Okay, so threats, regulations, data transfer headaches. What else is vital for defense, according to the sources? It can't just be tech and rules.
Absolutely not. Two other pillars come through loud and clear: people and cooperation.
People first.
Yes. There's a huge, widely acknowledged cybersecurity skills gap. Just finding and keeping enough people with the right expertise is a major challenge globally.
That makes sense. You need skilled people to actually implement all these complex rules and run the sophisticated defenses we've been talking about.
You do. So there's a big push on workforce development. We see reports and strategies from Australia, the EU, the OAS, all focused on training, upskilling, creating career paths in cyber.
Any specific examples?
Sure. Hong Kong's Monetary Authority has this enhanced competency framework. It actually lists specific recognized global certifications, like from ISICA, SANS, ISC2, alongside local qualifications, creating a clear standard for what skills are needed in financial cyber roles there.
So building the talent pipeline. And it's not just about the giant banks, is it? Smaller firms need help too.
Definitely. Capacity building is crucial for smaller banks or institutions in less mature markets. There are resources specifically designed to help them level up their security, like the CEIP's toolbox mentioned in the sources.
Okay, so people are key. What about the second pillar? Cooperation.
Given that finance is so interconnected and threats don't respect borders, sharing information is presented as absolutely vital.
Sharing threat intel.
Incident details. Both. Regulatory efforts strongly encourage this. It happens between financial institutions themselves, often through dedicated bodies like FS-ISAC or the Series Forum for Regulators, and critically, it happens between the private sector and government agencies.
Like banks reporting incidents to a national cyber agency.
Exactly. India's RBI encourages banks to report to their national CERT. Singapore's Cybersecurity Act has provisions specifically to make sharing easier legally. The idea is that a threat seen by one can help protect all collective defense.
And they practice this cooperation.
They do. There are large-scale exercises. We saw mentions of Cyber Europe, which is pan-European, and the Eurosystem's UNITIS exercise, which specifically tested financial infrastructure responses to data integrity attacks. These drills test how well everyone communicates and coordinates during a simulated crisis.
It really highlights that systemic interconnectedness again. Okay, let's try and wrap this up. It's been a real deep dive.
It has.
We started with the fact that cyber threats are seen as, arguably, the number one risk facing the financial system today.
Which has triggered this massive, complex, global regulatory response we've walked through, covering governance from the top, dynamic risk management, rapid incident response, rigorous testing, managing third-party risk, and aiming for overall operational resilience.
And layered on top of that is the significant challenge of moving data across borders, legally and safely, navigating different laws, and the whole equivalent protection issue highlighted by cases like Schrems.
But importantly, the sources remind us it's not just about tech and rules. There's a huge ongoing effort focused on people closing that skills gap, building expertise, and on fostering cooperation and information sharing to strengthen the entire ecosystem's defenses.
It really sounds like less of a spate you achieve and more of a continuous process. Which leads us to maybe a final thought for you to chew on. In this world of instant global data flows and constantly shape-shifting threats, is perfect cyber resilience actually attainable? Or is it fundamentally this ongoing race, this continuous cycle of adaptation, vigilance, and response? And if it is a continuous process, what does that really mean for how we think about security, not just in finance, but everywhere our lives are digitally connected?
That's a really important question, one that needs constant thought.
Indeed. Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We hope breaking down these sources is giving you some valuable insights into this critical area.
Thanks for joining us.
And one last time, a huge thank you to our sponsors, www.globalcompliancemap.com and www.generatepolicy.com for making this deep dive possible.